So today, the ideas was to just show you guys a bit the Flow library that we've been building and maintaining internally at Little Miss Robots. Yeah, show you a bit how it's built and what you can get out of it. I'm going to quickly introduce myself. My name is Maite. I'm a lead UX designer at Little Miss Robots. Been here for 8 years already. And yeah, you can always find me back on LinkedIn. And you can also check out what we do at Little Miss Robots via our websites or our socials. The program for this hour, I'm going to introduce the library itself and explain a bit how it came to be and show you what you can do with it quite easily. And then I will dive deeper into some aspects of it that I found are interesting and kind of make it a bit different than other UI kit or templates you might find online. And those are based on the variables, but also the responsiveness of the components in there. And I'll end with some tips and tricks to be more efficient when you prototype with Flow. Okay, let's go. So, Flow. A bit of context. So as I said, I work at Little Miss Robot, and we are an agency, which means if you ever worked in an agency context, that we do quite a lot of projects in any given year. And we do everything from service design to high-level wireframing, prototyping, visual design, animation, and so forth. We've been doing that for 15 years already, and we made the switch to Figma 5 years ago, just at the time a month before COVID hit. So that was really good decision there. And this is already the 4th iteration of Flow, so the library within Figma. We actually started it in Sketch back in the days. Good times. Yeah, we built everything from web apps to mobile apps to software products. Yeah, so it's very diverse. And if you've ever worked in that sort of context, you know that the early phase of design is usually quite fast and iterative. And so very quickly, we asked ourselves how we could make this design process more efficient so we could spend the budget and the time we had on details and more fun stuff, the details, what makes a great product, right? And kind of, yeah, make the more manual updating, iterating phase more efficient, basically. You might know some of those hurdles, might have faced them in your work daily. When you start a new project and you start from a blank canvas, always a stressful situation. You work maybe in a team with other designers, and they have their own ways of working, their own styles, their own habits of organizing their files and doing wireframes, for example. And if you have to take over from someone who's sick, let's say, that can be also a bit of an adjustment. Imagine you're working on the product. Yeah, you've been building your first iteration on it, and you forgot to make your main navigation a component. And so now you have to update every screen that has that frame in it. Been there, done that, never again. And same thing for building components over and over. Input fields, I don't know how many I built in my life, but too many, to be honest. So yeah, that was a bit where we were at the start. And that's why we decided, okay, internally, let's build this library that we can use whenever we start a project. So we're not reinventing the wheel. Buttons are buttons, navigation on navigation, links are links, etc. We just have a base to start from. It also kind of created a common language for wireframing internally, which means that anyone joining any project at any time would have quite a good understanding of how it's built and what components are used for what. It also allowed us to visualize concept quite efficiently and rapidly, especially if you're in a design sprint phase. For example, you have only like a few days to prototype, then you can go quite fast with this library already. And that also allows us to quickly test with users, show and validate with stakeholders. And so overall, this design phase became way more efficient, which gave us more time to spend on strategy, on content, visual design, interaction, animation, all the cool stuff. So yeah, that's the main reason why we built Flow. We also made sure that it wasn't just a UI kit, because those you can also find quite a lot of them online. You even have native one in Figma itself. But already at the beginning, it was very clear for us that this would be used throughout the whole wireframing phase. So even from information architecture to the detailed wireframe, we would have this one library. We also have elements in there that helps us document our decisions. That was also very important already at the beginning. We have building blocks, components, and sections. So to build pages, but also to build products. We have a whole setup of variables, which is quite useful if you want to then build a design system further on during the project. And also we keep it up to date. So if a component becomes obsolete, if Figma has a new update, we try to keep up with it. Also based on different projects that we do. So if we realize the pricing component, for example, is a new one in the latest release, yeah, it was just coming back often in our project, SaaS website and so on. So we thought, okay, let's just make it a resource that everyone can use. And then you have also a certain alignment on best practices and good UX for that specific component, for instance. So as I said, it's not just a UI kit, so you can actually go from really information architecture, so very high level, to wireflows if you make a sitemap of your website or product, for example, to detailed wireframes who are ready to be prototyped, can also be delivered for visual design, yeah, and so on. You can even build already a design system with it. So it has been, I released an update yesterday evening. So if you haven't duplicated it yet from Figma, please do. The link is also in the interface normally of the webinar. So make sure you have the latest version. Unfortunately, it's not possible to notify that an update is there, but just know there's an update. All right, so that's why we build it. Now I'm going to show you how to use it with some simple examples. So the first one is a web page. That's really a common, easy one. So you would have, how we would typically work is we use auto layout as much as we can because it's very easy. I don't know if you remember the old days where you had to resize your frame, your artboard, your screen, every time you added a line of content in your page. Yeah, never again. So basically, how we build it, we put auto layout on the whole page, basically, and then we just stack our sections in there. Each section is a component which has quite a lot of properties built in that you can adjust. So yeah, let's say you want a button in this one, you can easily add it. It resizes, your page resizes, everything is good. You can also use those little nodes component. Those are also made from Flow, and they help us document design decisions, also indicate to our stakeholders who not necessarily have access to an editor sit in Figma. So they can directly view it. Yeah, can communicate decisions in there. We see here, for example, that we have some comments on our designs already. We want to insert the quotes here. So how you would go about editing or adding a component or a section in this case, it's very easy. You would just duplicate it and then change it to something else. So you see here, I have all the components from Flow. The bullets, the color bullets indicates the hierarchy of it. So you have smaller elements you have building blocks, which are blue, and yellow is with the sections component. So let's see if I have a quote section. I can just change it here. But I have a quote. Maybe I want 2 quotes. Voila. And then I can override the text, the content in it. And it's as simple as that. Then here I have another comment. My call to action at the end of the page. It would be nice if it had a little input field so I can request a demo. Let's see if I have this. Oh, look at that. It's made for it. So yeah, we try to build component with the most common use cases that we can think of. So you don't have to detach too often. Of course, it's always possible and it's not a big deal. But then we also try to foresee most common situations. So that's it for building a simple web page. Again, auto layout is your best friend in this case. Now let's say you want to build something a bit more complex, maybe a multi-step form. So imagine you have your structure in your head, right? It's a form, it's gonna have like 4 or 5 steps. So maybe a step wizard would be nice, and then some heading to show the title of the first step, then a little form, and then a button bar. Button bar would have previews and next button, kind of classic form layout. So here I can just replace those little slot components. Let's look for a step wizard. Okay, so I have it here. Now it's really with check boxes, check marks. So that's nice, but maybe I want it to be numbered. That's maybe a better look for it. Then here I'm gonna look for a heading. I have different type of heading. I have textual, interactive. Those would have a lot of buttons. Maybe that's not what I'm looking for here. Maybe a simple text one, and maybe I make it a bit smaller. All right, that looks good. I can add some explanation on the step. Now here I want a form. I could build one just stacking components, input fields and so on. I actually already built one in this file, so let me just fetch that one. So here you see a lot of different form elements. Those are always really painful to build. So we just decided let's make it once and for all. And then we don't have to look at it again. Password fields, for example, are always special. You need requirements. You need to show when it's filled that it has like the little bullets, for example. The email address, let's say that one is really required actually. So all the fields have always those little built-in subcomponents that just make it easier to build up your page. You see also we have drop downs. So if you would want to have some interaction in there, you can always have the little drop down appear, for example, on click. So that's also built in. And then finally, let's add my button bar. So button, I have quite a few options. Okay, I called it button group, same. Previous next, that's what I'm looking for. There you go. Yeah, I could stack them if I would be on mobile, for example, but looks nice to me right now. That's what I wanted. So that's also like how easy you can start building up pages, basically. Now let's say, last example, you want to stack this or insert this new form stepper you built into a more finished interface, maybe a product you have, for example. That's also quite easy. Again, auto layout is your friend. So you see here, I have this side navigation panel, for example, that's also a component from Flow, which can be used for more product-like interfaces. Here I have my form, and then here you see it's the same step wizard, same component, but I decided the vertical layout would be more useful in this case, because then it can grow. I can add a bit more description and information. My button bar will be fixed at the bottom, so if I have a long form, I always have my action visible. And this panel, I can collapse it if I want to or not. So that's also, then you have a product or a web page. So those two kind of are the most common product we usually build internally. So we cover those with Flow. So that's how you build simple elements. Now I'm going to dive a bit deeper into some more specific aspect. So this is where the nerding out starts. Hopefully you don't get too lost, but let's go. The first one is so the variable. As you may have noticed, so there's quite a lot of updates coming that came out last year and this year on variables, and you probably saw already a lot of people going crazy on dark mode, and that's usually what most people use the variables for. But we actually experimented with a few other things you can do with variables, which are quite interesting beyond just the dark mode. Of course, we have dark mode because it's useful. We worked it out for states. So sometimes you want component to change from inactive to active. If you have a list item or a table row, for example, but you don't want it to be a variant in a component because you know people are going to detach it anyway. So we worked out a system there where it's handled with variables, and it's quite a nice one, I would say. Then the status, that's another one that you can also experiment with. So Figma on organization plan only allows for 4 modes in variables, which is perfect because that's usually the 4 feedback mode: info, success, warning, error. So we also experimented a bit there with how far can we take the variables, and you can actually go quite far, which is nice. Maybe too far sometimes, but it's interesting experiment. And the last one, responsiveness, that one we found out is actually probably the most useful. So using spacing variables, you can quickly go from desktop to mobile, which can help if you build your whole prototype in desktop mode, and then the client is like, but wait, how would it look on mobile? And then you're like, I have a day left on the budget. Okay, let's quickly make it mobile. That kind of situation. Quickly, just to recap on what are variables. So it's just a reusable value that you give to colors or spacing or any element to give it context and purpose. Usually, you would go from hex values to a first layer. That would be the theme, for example. You would give a first layer of context to your colors. And then you can go as far as having 1 or 2 more levels where you give even more purpose. So let's say, for example, I have a white color that's F hex value. And in the first layer, I'm going to call it neutral 0. But then I will give it a bit more context and say it will be used as a background clear, but also as text inverted in dark mode, for example. So that value can be reused multiple times. In the end, it's quite useful because you can update this value, and every time it's been used somewhere else, it will also update. So it's a bit of a component system, but for styles. Flow is quite a simple library, so we didn't go as far as to have all those levels. We stick with the middle one, since we just have dark mode, for instance. So we stayed quite high level on this project. But then only with this, you can already do some nice things. So that's quite basic when you talk about light and dark modes, going from black text to to white text, for example. But you can also push it a bit further. So you see in this example, I have this little elevation on light mode. If you just transfer it one-on-one to dark, it will create this fat white shadow that's not very nice. So I just changed the value to a 0% transparent, full transparent value. And that way you can also adjust a bit how your designs look. So it's not always one-on-one You see the button as well doesn't have this shadow. So yeah, you can also play with it and be a bit creative in that sense. But also that's quite yeah, typical, you would say. Now for the inactive active one, that one was more fun to play with, let's say, because basically I just created a collection of variables and I named it default state and active state, so 2 modes. And then for each of those, I defined what would be the background, what would be the background once it's active. So you see here, I have a table. It's not a component. Actually, if you look at the rows are not components either. So that gives a lot of flexibility to the user who can build any tables how they want it. The only components in here are the cells, which is the smallest component you can build. But then you see those 2 rows are set on active state, and those are on default state. So just by changing the modes, I can change the background color, the border color. The checkbox is now checked. I can even, if I want, say, look, those texts, I would actually want them to change color as well when they're selected. So I just need to look for my variable color that I applied. Here I see my collection state text. So if I just apply this variable, I see that my text now is highlighted when in select mode. So you can play with it and go as far as you want. For me, it's quite an interesting one for some components because it allowed to not constrict too much with components. But again, it's maybe overkill for simple menu item, for example. So yeah, a nice one, but also to handle with care. Let me just take a break. All right. So state, active, inactive, good one to remember. The status, that one was also an interesting one to play with. Again, I would not recommend to use it everywhere. It's more of a fun thing to play with. So basically the setup is a bit the same. I have a collection for my statuses, and each mode is a color. You can also just name it info, success, warning, and danger. But I like the little color bullets, so I use that. And then I defined again my background colors, my border, icon, text, whatever element that would change with the feedback, the different feedback. And I also add some copy. So that can be useful if you have an element where you want the copy to change from different feedback status, or have a simple message that would change. Here, for example, I could apply that to this little piece of text here. I could say, look, can you link this to my status tag property, for example? And then the text would change automatically. So I can predefine some copy there. If it's copy that you use a lot, then you can make it relevant for your product. Can also be useful with translation if you have key text pieces that you want to be the same everywhere. And it's also useful if you go a bit more crazy into prototyping. You can link those different modes. So you can say, if I click here, I want my mode to change from success to error. And that is more, it's easier to do when you have those variables set up than when you don't. A bit less screens in prototype. Again, it's for you to think about what's the added value. It's not always necessary, I would say, but it's a fun one. So you can play around with it. Maybe one last little tip I would give for the variable, because that's one that a lot of people don't know. It's quite hidden actually as a feature. but it really allows you to clean up your variables and what you see in your override panel. So you can scope variables. You do a right click on all your variables and you say edit. And in the scope tab, you will see that you can say these values only apply to font size, for example. So then it's less confusing for the user when they are viewing your components and they want to adjust the spacing, for example, they don't see the typography sizes in there. So that one I found quite useful to keep it clean. Again, it's about making fast decision and being efficient. So that starts also with the scoping. All right. So that was a bit how we have a bit of fun with variables, but now the responsiveness, that one is more of a very useful one, especially when you're designing for multiple across device. I don't think anyone is designing only for desktop, only for mobile anymore. So we found that one quite useful. How it works, what you want to have in the end is your frame in desktop mode and say, okay, now I want it on mobile, and you want everything in there to, of course, this one is broken, to just work perfectly and resize to mobile. Now, how is this magic possible? Well, first of all, it's not magic, but it's quite simple in a way. You just define how your component should look like on mobile. So let's say this header component, if I look at it in my flow library, so the one we use internally, which is the same one that you can duplicate from the community, by the way. Here I have defined my desktop mode and my mobile mode. And you will notice here that I call it responsive with S as a size and L. And this is actually the same naming I use in my variable mode. So you would see that in my variable responsive, I have the two modes which have the same name. This allows me to connect the two and tell Figma, when I go from this mode to this mode, I want my component to go from this property to this variant to this variant. So this is the setup. And then that means here I just connect it. So this is my property, right? It's an instance of my component. I just apply the variable to it. I say, hey, connect it to this responsive. This means that if I switch modes, it will know, oh, I need to change variant from desktop to mobile. And since it's all in auto layout, again, your best friend, it will just resize perfectly. You could have some components that don't really need a mobile variant if all you do is stack elements that can be handled with auto layout only. But you will see for some components, for example, I don't know why this one breaks every time. Anyway, so you see this one, live demos. This one reacts a bit differently. I don't want just my cards to stack on top of each other. I want to have a horizontal swipe, for example. That's something I need to define on the component itself. And Figma will just know, oh, okay, if I go from desktop to mobile, then I need to put it in a horizontal scroll, which will keep my override, my text, everything I put in there. So yeah. All right. So how do you do that really in Magic? I'm just going to show you again how it's built. So on your main component, you need to have this property that connects to your responsive modes. You also need to then on your instance connect to that mode. So Figma knows what to do. And then you need to build your component using the variables of each of those two modes, right? So let's say here I have my desktop version. You see the padding and the size of it, the full size, are all linked to variables. And in mobiles, those variables are just two smaller sizes. You notice as well the breadcrumb component kind of changes, right? So maybe when I go to mobile, I want this breadcrumb to be just a back button instead of the whole thing because it's take too much space. That you can also do. So you just need your building block basically to have that same property, and then Figma will just know to change everything at once. So that's really useful if you have those small elements. Could be buttons, for example. You want them to stack instead of being next to each other. Same system you can use here. So yeah, responsiveness is quite a useful one for us. All right, now the last part. I'm gonna go a bit faster so we have time for questions. It's gonna be perfect timing, you'll see. All right, I have 4 tips and tricks for you when you start prototyping with your screens, your design. Yeah, gonna repeat that. It's a made-up value anyway, but the wireframing phase is very iterative. So you're gonna lose a lot of time just manually updating your designs. So how can you make that as painless as possible? The first one I would say would be your navigation. This element will come back super often in your design. It's on every screen basically. So again, don't forget to make it a component. You'll save time in the long term. And sometimes it can have some tricky interaction on it. Like on hover, I want to fly out to drop out, but I want to be able to select stuff in there. So this we are faced with quite often during our work as well. So how you would typically start it is just have your component directly from Flow. You override the menu, how you need it for your specific product, and then you would basically wrap this component into another component that would make it local to your file. This will just allow you to then add your interaction on your file and copy every instance of that component that you use everywhere else in your file will have those links, those interaction embedded. So here, for example, if I go in prototype mode, I have a simple interaction in place. So on click, I want to see this drop down. Here as well, on click, I want to see this drop down. So that's really a simple one. When I click here, I want it to close. When I click here, I want it to close. And if I click outside of the overlay, I also want it to close. So what you would get is really something basic. I click, I open, I can navigate. If I go everywhere on the screen without clicking, nothing happens. But if I click, it closes and so on. So basic one, right? Then you might have some situation where you're like, it would be better if it was on hover, for example. But if you actually try to put it on hover, then the moment your mouse will leave this area, your overlay will disappear. So that could be something a bit annoying. We found a little workaround. Maybe you know about it, but we were really on an aha moment when we found it. So you can use the actual mouse enter and mouse leave interaction, which means that you say to Figma, when my mouse enters this area, I want to show the overlay, but I didn't put any mouse leave interaction yet. So let me remove that one. I will say only when my mouse leaves this overlay, I want it to close. So I can just add that interaction here, mouse leave, close overlay. I'm gonna copy this one, put it this one as well. And here I need to add also mouse enter. All right, so how does this work? If I play my interaction now. So you see on hover, it opens. I can still navigate to the other elements in that dropdown. But if I leave it, it disappears. So that's the behavior I was looking for. Also, if I hover over the next one, I also see my elements here. And again, they disappear if I leave the area. So that little trick saved us a lot of duplicates of that component. And you notice I'm using my main component. I'm using an instance here, so the links are kept whenever I make a change on the main component. It's super useful if you have to do that for 50 screens. So that was the first one. The second one is viable in prototyping. Again, that one, people went crazy when it's launched. I think there's actually very little use cases where it's useful in a wireframing phase, because yeah, you just reach a point where it gets so complex that you might as well just build the product. So we use it in very limited cases. Again, you have to ask yourself, is it worth the time and effort? This is only a validation phase. They would usually show you examples like, oh, you have the little amount of item in your cart that changes with each click. Yes, but is that really what you will test? Is that really useful at this point in your project? Probably not. So one use case we found that is quite interesting is when you have, again, I'm come back to that multi-step form, where you want some things to happen in step 4 based on what the user inputs in step 1, for example. So that's a use case that comes back quite often in more complex products, and that's where you could use the variables in prototyping. I will just quickly show you how it's set up. So I have this little checkbox here. If I select it, I want that at the end, I have a little success message that shows up saying, hey, you subscribe to the newsletter. It's very basic, but it's just to show. You see here, I have my state linked to a variable already. How it looks in my panel. So I have this set up. I have a default state, active state. This is just a string to connect the property of the component to those two modes. And then I have a Boolean. The Boolean just says, is it on or off? And this one I will apply to the little message at the end. So now it's not selected, and my little notification, which is hidden here, is also off. You see it is linked to the variable Boolean that I just showed. And so then for the interaction itself, I actually put it on the next button. So here I say to Figma, when you navigate to the next screen, check if the state, so state, the variable itself, is on active mode or not. If it's on active, then set the mode of that collection I just showed to active. If it's not on active, just set it to default. So that's one conditional interaction on it. And if I play it, I can subscribe. And then if I go to the next, I have this message. If I don't subscribe, then I don't see the message. So that's very easy. Conditional interaction in it. You don't need to go into mathematics and variables, crazy stuff. And we find it quite useful in some more complex interactions. All right, so that's variables in prototyping. Now the last two tips. The first one is slots. I really love slots. I think it's one of the greatest invention. But what is it? It's actually those little components you see here. We use them in some of the component in Flow because it allows you to replace it with basically any other component. It's very useful if you have a model, let's say, and you want a form in there, but yeah, you never know how many fields and so on. You can't make it a generic one. So you just put a slot in there, and on your local file, you can build any component you want and just replace it. That makes it super easy to build custom interface while keep using the flow component. So you see here, this is my flow model. I didn't detach it. I just replaced my slot with the form component I showed you earlier that I built in this file. I can replace with any local file. I can also replace it with a third-party component library. So if I'm working with a client that has already a library, for example, and I want to show already in the wireframe phase some key elements, then I can just slot them in. Same with third-party kits and so on. So that one we found is quite useful. In Accordeon, we would use it as well because you never know which content people want to put in there by definition. So we just have a bit of text and then a slot, and you can replace it with anything. And the last one, not the least, this one we also use it quite a lot internally because it's, again, just gaining time. We use Flow as design system as a base. It already has the atomic structure I showed you, so styles, building blocks, and then components. It already has a setup, a variable setup that can be easily overridden with your specific color values that you're going to use in your project at the end in visual design. So yeah, the spacing also already in there. You just need to adjust the value depending on your specific product. You can change the fonts. Everything can be overridden, but then you already have quite of a structure. So here are a few examples. I'm actually just going to show you in the section. So every page is actually kind of built the same way. You have your main component on the side, and then here we have a bit of very high level documentation. And this can be also taken over for more like dev handover or just showing to other designers how a component is supposed to behave. And I'm going to show the buttons because everyone loves buttons. But there as well, you have already the little component matrix setup. So you can very easily just replace it and add a bit of extra information, and you would have your design system already kind of set up. Yeah, so that's it for what you can do with Flow. And now questions.